Thank you, Frank, for the wonderful lead up into this. I'm glad that you touched upon those very timely topics. Now, uh, Frank, when Frank and I think about the concepts of care, we usually talk about it in the context of what we call authentic care. And for us, authentic care refers to a shared or vested interest. And what that means is that a student knows that if they do well, if they hit the mark, if they succeed, that you as the educator are going to personally feel like you did well. And on the flip side, if they don't do well, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, whatever it is, that you are going to personally feel like you did not do well because there's this shared or linked vested interest. And so as part of the work that we've done, quantitatively and qualitatively, we have explored this concept, what it means to express authentic care. And fortunately, we've collected a large amount of data, particularly in California, that has focused on different ways that faculty members and staff members can express care to students. So on the next slide, what I'll do is I'll talk about what we're learning from our data. So first, I'll note that this is data that we've collected over the past several years. So this is a sample from 2018 of over 13,000 students. So this is not a small sample. Our data is collected in randomly selected course sections, in-person sampling. So obviously this data was collected pre-COVID. And what we did is we looked at correlates. What relates to expressions of care? So we have several variables that we collect that basically measure to what extent does a student perceive that their faculty member cares about them. And then we were able to look at how those variables relate to other ways in which faculty members either engage or build a certain type of climate or culture around students. And so what you see here are what we call the top 5 predictors of expression of care. So students were most likely or had higher scores for saying that faculty members expressed care to them when there were 5 conditions that were in place. When faculty members knew about their academic goals and their career goals, they knew about their life aspirations, so they knew information about them, and that they knew their name. And oftentimes in our qualitative work, what we find is it's not simply knowing the student's name, but referring to them by name in a way that recognizes that that student is important to you. So it's oftentimes taking students who feel like they are on the margins, that they are invisible, and making them visible environments that are hostile. And then the last piece is knowing important information about their personal life. So these components are ways that educators can express care to students from the faculty perspective. Now, on the next slide, you'll see what this looks like for staff. And what we have is another set of variables that look at expression of care from staff members. And what we've done is we've looked at what are some of the correlates that relate to this in terms of that student's perspective. So there's higher scores for expression of care as perceived by students from staff when they believe that campus services provide them with the help that they need, when campus services provide them with accurate information, when those services are easy to access and available when they need them, and they know where to go to for help. So in the staff context, it's about knowing what they need and making sure that that's available and reaching and providing them with it. So that's the way that staff members can ensure that they are expressing that care towards students. Now, this is a sample of overall, looking at students across the board, our students in community colleges. Now let's go a little bit deeper and look really at our students of color. Now, on the next slide, what you're going to see is information on what we call a cluster analysis. So this is from a smaller sample now of still a large sample in many contexts, 7,000 students who are students of color. And in our way of looking at students of color, we are looking at Black, Latinx, Native American, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander students as our primary focus. And then what we did was with the cluster analysis, we basically were able to look at all our variables around care and essentially create two measures of care, one for faculty, one for staff, based upon how students responded. And then that was broken up essentially based upon our analysis into really 5 different groups. The 5 different groups are depicted on the right-hand side of your screen, as well as on the left, and that's what those 5 clusters represent. So the first cluster are those that essentially have low expression of care, that the students don't believe that essentially that what they're doing expresses care, and that's that 8.9% of the population. Then there are those that you can see higher scores for faculty care, but lower scores for staff care, and that's that 6.7%. Then there are those that they receive high expression of care from staff and low from faculty. That's at 21%. Then you'll see the pullout of that 30.6% who have high scores for both. So in this context, these are those students who, in comparison to the overall population, are receiving more care. So really only 30% of our students of color. And then there are those that we would refer to as marginal because they're in the middle. Now, this analysis really shows us a few different things. One, that there are different populations that have different ways that they are engaged by educators, and that they commonly fall into 5 different groups. The second thing that it shows us is that just because a student receives care from staff doesn't mean that they're receiving that same type of care from faculty, and vice versa. And then the third major component that this tells us is that there is a pretty sizable population of students who aren't really receiving this care in general. Now, when we take these 5 groups and we think about these 5 groups of students, our students of color experience these 5 different ways in which they're engaged by educators in terms of care. On the next slide, we see how that translates into differential outcomes. So we have a variable that looks at to what extent are students on track to achieve their goals. So students who are either on track or not on track based upon the varying goals that they might have. So some students, it might be that they're here to transfer or to earn an associate's degree or contract training, whatever it might be. And what you can see is if you look on the far left-hand side, 68% of those students, when they are in that uncared for category, say that they're on track to achieve their goals. But when you look at that group in purple, those that had those higher levels, 85% of them are on track to achieve their goals. So what we're seeing here is that there is a sizable, notable, and significant difference based upon our models across these groups based upon levels of care. So care is not just good because it makes people feel good. It's important because it directly relates and translates to student success. Now, on the next slide, what we can see is what this looks like in terms of service use. And this may be just taking a point that seems obvious and putting some data behind it, but sometimes it's important to do. Overall, the tone of this slide, what you'll see is that when students believe that staff members don't care about them, guess what? They don't use those services. And when they do perceive that they care about them, then they're more likely to use those services. And you can see the difference between those groups in terms of academic advising, career services, the transfer center, the library, computer labs, tutoring services. There's noticeable differences across those groups, ranging from 10% to 20% point differences in terms of their use of those services when they perceive that people actually care about them and their success. Now, we also have to recognize that this might differ across populations. So if you look on the next slide, we can see what this looks like in a different way. So what we've done now is we've taken all of our measures for care and we've standardized them. So you'll see that black bar in the middle, that represents essentially the mean. So when we think about students' overall experience with care, the mean would be in the middle, right? And those that would be above that line would be, they would experience higher levels of care in comparison to the other populations. And those below the line would experience lower levels of care. And so then when we start looking at this for faculty, we see that our Asian men and women have scores that fall below that line. And yes, these are significant differences, by the way. For Southeast Asian women, but noticeably different are the scores for our Latinx population, both for Latinos and Latinas. You'll notice that for them, and even also for multi-ethnic students to a lesser extent, there are some differences in experiences with care. Based upon this, the group that care is most restricted from are our Latinas. Think about how that creates a differential experience that influences and negates student success. Now, on the next slide, you'll see what this looks like when we do the same thing for staff care. And we can see that, interestingly, the differences are noticeable. Now, one thing I will point out, I should have said this earlier, though we do have large sample sizes, we did not have enough of a sample size to run these data for those who might identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. So we apologize that we don't have a sufficient sample size to be able to break it out in that way. Now, when looking at staff care, you can see that the group that's most affected by care in terms of staff that has the lowest scores are our Asian students, both men and women, and our Southeast Asian women. And then you can also see a similar patterns we saw last time, our Latinx population. Now, given the demographics of our state and the high proportion of our institutions that are HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, as well as those that are ANAPISIs, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institutions, we find these data to be very disconcerting and to indicate that there's very much more that we need to do. The last point that I'll point out before turning it back over to Frank is that many of you might be wondering about the scores for African American students and Black students. And what we find is that on average, those scores do fall above those mean averages across groups. However, when we look at the standard deviations and we look at the dispersion of scores, even though they have on average scores that fall higher above the mean, they are more likely to experience some of the highest levels of either care or the highest levels of uncare. But because I don't have error bars in here, you're not able to see what that looks like. So with that caveat, I'll turn it back over to Frank.